Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The heat over Gorongosa rose in trembling sheets, warping the horizon into a wavering mirage of copper and dust. Paulo felt grit grinding between his teeth each time he swallowed the taste as dry as old gunpowder. Cicadas screeched from the bush with a mechanical sharpness that made the silence between bursts of sound feel dangerous. The convoy moved slowly, Soviet trucks groaning under loads of ammunition that reeked of oiled metal. The explosion struck like a fist from beneath the earth. A flash of orange ripped the lead truck into the air, spraying shards of iron that hissed as they cut through the heated wind. Paulo hit the gravel hard stones, slicing the skin on his elbows, while a wave of dust rolled over him like hot smoke. Burning diesel filled his lungs thick and bitter enough to make his eyes water. Gunfire erupted from the grass in short, violent bursts that cracked like snapped bones. Muzzle flashes flickered deep in the brush, lighting up leaves with brief, hellish glows. Bullets kicked dirt into Paulo's face, the grain stinging like sparks as he crawled beneath the nearest truck. The metal was scorching under his palms, radiating heat like a cooking plate left too long on the fire. A ricochet sparked inches from his cheek, leaving the smell of scorched rubber and hot steel lingering in the air. Through the dust, he saw a soldier stumbling with his arm aflame, ash drifting from his sleeve like black snow. Someone screamed for help, the voice muffled by Paulo's ringing ears until it dissolved into a thin, distant moan. The world felt both blindingly loud and impossibly far away. An RPG hissed across the road, trailing a line of smoke that smelled sharp and chemical. It smashed into the rear truck with a thunderous burst that rattled Paulo's ribs against the dirt. Splinters and fragments rained down, tapping against the undercarriage like hard rain on a metal roof. Bodies scrambled in every direction, boots slipping on gravel soaked with fuel. For a moment the battlefield quieted, not in peace, but in anticipation, as if the bush itself were holding its breath. The smoke curled low, wrapping around Paulo like a choking blanket, while the sunlight fractured through it in golden shards. His hands shook violently as he tightened his grip on his rifle, the barrel hot enough to burn his fingertips. Sweat trickled down his neck, carrying the taste of dust into the collar of his uniform. Then the rebels' voices drifted through the grass, low, confident, closing in. A grenade rolled into the open, its dull metallic clink, louder than the gunfire that had come before. Paulo pressed his face deeper into the dirt, inhaling the dry mineral scent of the earth, moments before the blast ripped across the road. Pebbles and flames swept past him in a suffocating wave, and yet buried under the chaos, something larger pulsed beneath this ambush. Paulo didn't know it, but the bullets slicing past him were purchased in Pretoria, and the rifles firing back were flown in from Moscow's frozen airfields. This firefight was not an isolated skirmish in the bush. It was a collision point of the Cold War played out on a dirt road, where soldiers like Paulo carried weapons they barely understood in a struggle shaped by distant men who would never hear their screams. Independence arrived in 1975 with drums, gun salutes, and fireworks that crackled over Maputo's harbor, scattering sparks into the humid night air. People danced in the streets, their feet kicking up fine dust that mixed with the smell of spilled beer and roasted peanuts. Flags snapped in the breeze like newly freed sails, bright cloth slapping against metal poles. For a brief moment, the city tasted like victory, sharp, sweet, intoxicating. Then almost overnight, the Portuguese were gone. Apartment doors slammed for the last time, echoing down stairwells that still smelled of cooking oil and detergent. At the port, cranes creaked as crates of furniture and machinery were loaded onto ships' ropes, groaning while the vessels pulled away from the docks. Offices were left with phones that no longer rang calendars frozen on the month of departure. Inside the ministries, typewriters sat silent on desks coated with a thin layer of dust. Files yellowed in open cabinets, paper curling at the edges in the damp coastal air. New Mozambican officials walked those corridors in shoes that squeaked on the tiled floors, the scent of cheap cologne failing to cover the musty odor of abandonment. They touched maps pinned to walls, tracing districts they now governed, but barely knew. On the streets, shortages announced themselves not with words, but with empty shelves. Stores that once displayed canned goods and sweets behind glass now held only a few dull items, soap matches, sometimes nothing at all. Customers shuffled across worn floorboards, fingertips grazing bare metal racks as if touch alone might summon food. The smell of stale air replaced the scent of fresh bread that had once greeted morning shoppers. In the neighborhoods, power cuts stretched longer each week. Refrigerators hummed briefly, then died with a low sigh, leaving meat to spoil and milk to sour. Families lit candles whose wax dripped onto cracked tables, the flickering flames throwing jittery shadows against peeling paint. The smoky smell of paraffin lanterns seeped into curtains, and clothing turning the whole city into a dim, flickering echo of itself. FRELIMO's leaders tried to fill the vacuum with speeches and slogans. Loudspeakers attached to lampposts crackled as voices proclaimed a new era of unity and discipline, their words distorted by static. Posters of Samora Machel and guerrilla fighters appeared on walls, the ink still smelling sharp and chemical under the sun. Youth brigades marched through streets in mismatched boots, chanting phrases that bounced off concrete like hollow drum beats. But beyond the rhetoric, the country's skeleton was already showing. On the rail lines, locomotives sat idle, their metal frames streaked with rust and dust paint, flaking under the relentless heat. In the countryside, tractors that had once plowed fields stood motionless beneath acacia trees, tires sinking slowly into the soil. Farmers ran calloused hands over cold engines, feeling the rough texture of neglect under their fingers. Between the celebration and the void, Mozambique drifted into a dangerous in-between, free but unsteady, like a man stepping off a ship onto crumbling stone. The air still carried the aftertaste of gunpowder from the independence struggle, but now there was no clear enemy to confront, only problems spreading in every direction. And in that fragile space, as offices stood empty and markets thinned out, other actors far beyond Mozambique's borders began to notice just how vulnerable this young country had become. FRELIMO's turn toward Marxism arrived with the weight of a steel door slamming shut. Radios that once played music now opened each morning with ideological lessons, the announcers' voices flat and grainy like sandpaper on metal. Posters urging the creation of the new man appeared on walls still stained with colonial paint, the glue drying into a sharp chemical scent under the sun. People paused beneath them, not out of belief, but out of caution. Inside the ministries, Soviet advisors walked the hallways with quiet authority. Their leather shoes clicked sharply on the tile, echoing through rooms that smelled of dust, ink, and aging furniture. They brought binders filled with diagrams of collective farms and model communes, the pages stiff with factory-fresh paper. Mozambican officials listened, nodding as sweat pooled under their collars in the humid air. Soon the policies reached the countryside. Cadres arrived in battered trucks, stepping onto dry earth with boots that left deep authoritative prints. Villagers were gathered under shade trees, the air thick with the smell of cassava leaves and livestock, as officials read proclamations about collectivized farms. Oxen were retied under new owners, and tools that had belonged to families for generations were cataloged on clipboards that smelled faintly of rust. Communal farms struggled almost immediately. Dawn broke over fields where workers waited for instructions that arrived too late or not at all. Rows of maize wilted under the dry season's sun, their leaves crisping into brittle curls that crackled when touched. Radios played propaganda songs over loudspeakers mounted on poles, the tinny sound drifting across fields where harvest shrank each month. In the cities, nationalization reshaped daily life in more claustrophobic ways. Private shops closed overnight, their metal shutters pulled down with screeches that echoed down empty streets. State-run stores replaced them shelves lined with plain paper packages labeled in blocky black letters. The air inside smelled of cardboard and stale flour, while queues snaked out the door even before sunrise. Security services grew quickly under East German guidance. Nighttime knocks on apartment doors carried a cold metallic echo that sent neighbors peering through cracked curtains. Men were taken for questioning their footsteps, scraping across stairwells as families whispered prayers in darkened rooms. The fear lingered in the air long after the boots disappeared, a sour scent like old sweat trapped behind closed doors. Schools became laboratories for ideological molding. Chalk dust mixed with the smell of cheap ink as children recited slogans they barely understood, their small voices trembling in unison. Teachers lectured about class enemies while sweat trickled down their backs in the heat of overcrowded classrooms. Lessons that once taught arithmetic now explained revolutionary virtues scrawled across chalkboards in shaky white lines. Despite speeches and murals, Mozambique was not transforming into the disciplined socialist nation its leaders envisioned. Instead, shortages deepened, suspicion widened, and the ideological machinery tightened until ordinary life began to crack under its weight. And in those widening cracks out in the bush, where the state's slogans meant little Renamo found fertile ground for a rebellion that was about to ignite with terrifying force. The first rumors drifted in from the west like wind carrying the scent of distant fire. Traders whispered that men with foreign boots and unfamiliar rifles were moving through the bush, their tracks too disciplined to belong to villagers. At night, people heard the low rumble of engines across the border, not trucks transporting goods, but vehicles carrying a new kind of threat. The air grew tense, as if the land itself sensed something approaching. In Rhodesia, intelligence officers studied Mozambique with cold surgical focus. Cigarette smoke curled above maps spread across metal desks, the paper edges curling in the dry office air. They needed a weapon against the country's sheltering Zimbabwean guerrillas, and Mozambique, fragile and newly socialist, became the chosen battlefield. Recruits were gathered from prisoners, deserters, and disillusioned farmers' men whose lives smelled of sweat, poverty, and desperation. The training camps were carved into remote bushland where red earth stained every boot sole. Recruits learned to shoot under the barked commands of Rhodesian instructors, the smell of gun oil thick in the hot air. They crawled through thorny underbrush skin, scraped raw hearing bullets crack overhead as if the sky itself were splitting. At night, campfires snapped and spat embers while new fighters whispered fears into the darkness. When Rhodesia fell, South Africa picked up the operation with ruthless efficiency. Covert trucks rumbled across hidden trails, their engines humming under tarps soaked in dust and fuel. Crates marked with falsified labels hid ammunition that rattled softly with each turn. By the time the cargo reached Renamo units, the wooden boxes smelled of travel heat diesel and long nights on the road. Renamo fighters moved through the bush like predators built from silence. Their bare feet pressed into soft earth, leaving nearly invisible prints beneath the tall, sun-baked grass. They carried rifles that gleamed with fresh oil magazines clicking into place with the hard metallic certainty of purpose. Villages heard them before they saw them, the soft rustle of leaves disturbed in rhythm too precise to be animals. The first raids came at dusk, when the smell of cooking fires hung heavy in the air. Doors burst open under rifle butts, sending splinters flying across dirt floors as families clung to each other. Chickens scattered in frantic flurries, feathers drifting through smoke-filled courtyards. Rebel voices barked orders sharp and fast, demanding food loyalty, or the children taken by force into the bush. Some civilians welcomed Renamo, believing them to be protectors against FRELIMO's heavy hand. Others saw only terror men who left ashes where schools once stood and silence where laughter had lived. Night became the enemy. Lamps were extinguished early to hide the glow that might draw attention. Even dogs learned to stop barking, sensing danger and the scent of gunpowder lingering in the breeze. By the time FRELIMO understood the scale of the threat, Renamo was no longer a handful of malcontents hiding in the mountains. It had grown into a shadow army fed by foreign strategy, fueled by village fear, and sharpened by the harsh logic of guerrilla war. And it was preparing to strike at Mozambique with a ferocity that would turn the countryside into a theater of fire and grief. The village of Namapaza settled into its usual uneasy quiet as dusk bled into darkness. Cooking fires died down, leaving the air thick with the fading smell of roasted maize and wood smoke. Children curled into their mothers' sides inside reed huts, breathing softly as the night wind slipped through the cracks in the thatch. Even the goats seemed nervous, shifting restlessly as if sensing something coming. Just before dawn, a rumble broke the silence. The uneven growl of a Soviet-made truck forcing its way down the narrow dirt path. FRELIMO soldiers climbed out with stiff, exhausted movements, their uniforms damp with sweat and smelling of gun oil and dust. Flashlights swept across the huts in harsh white beams that made villagers shield their eyes. Commands followed immediately, sharp and impatient, echoing across the clearing like snapped branches. Men were lined up in the center of the village, while women clutched their children, holding them so tightly their knuckles turned pale. A sergeant shouted questions about Renamo sightings, his breath carrying the sour scent of sleepless nights. When an elder hesitated, a rifle butt struck him across the shoulder with a hollow thud, sending a cloud of dirt into the air. The villagers' fear hung thick, almost metallic on the tongue. By mid-morning, the soldiers departed, leaving deep tire grooves carved into the wet soil. Only then did people begin to move again, slowly, like animals testing an unfamiliar clearing. The smell of disturbed earth mingled with the faint scent of cassava porridge simmering inside huts. But no one spoke above a whisper. The air still crackled with the residue of the soldiers' presence. Nightfall brought a colder, quieter terror. As darkness thickened, a breeze rustled through the tall grass with a steady, unsettling rhythm. Mothers blew out their lamps early, letting the smoky paraffin scent fade rather than risk a sliver of light betraying their homes. The entire village held its breath listening to the forest. Then came the sound everyone feared, soft footsteps, too many to be hunters, not heavy enough to be soldiers. Renamo fighters emerged from the shadows, their silhouettes sharp against the moonlight. Their bodies smelled of sweat dust and long marches through the bush. They spoke in quick-clipped tones as they confiscated maize, seized livestock, and demanded the names of suspected government collaborators. A boy no older than 12 was pulled forward by the wrist, his sandals scraping weak patterns into the dirt. His mother tried to shield him, her hands trembling as she reached out, but a rebel shoved her aside with a curt gesture. The boy's quiet sob turned into a choked gasp as he was dragged toward the tree line. His mother fell to her knees, her fingers clawing at the dirt, which crumbled between her nails like dry ash. When the rebels finally melted back into the darkness, they came from the village remained frozen in place. The smell of extinguished torches drifted across the clearing, bitter and smoky, mixing with the salt of unspoken grief. No one moved until the forest swallowed the last echo of their footfalls. And everyone knew, as surely as they knew the taste of their own water, that the soldiers would return at dawn and the cycle would begin again. The sun hung over the clearing like a molten disk, turning every breath into something hot and heavy. A battered truck rattled into the village, its metal sides vibrating with each bump until it lurched to a stop beside the cashew tree. FRELIMO cadres jumped down their red scarves bright against the dust-coated air, smelling of sweat and the diesel that clung to their clothes. Children stopped mid-play, stones and sticks slipping quietly from their hands. Villagers were herded beneath the cashew tree's broad canopy, its bark warm and rough beneath the palms of those who leaned on it for balance. A cadre lifted a dented tin megaphone, its rim smelling faintly of rust and old charcoal. When his voice blasted through it, the sound crackled like burning wood, distorting the slogans into jagged fragments. People flinched with each barked order even before they understood the words. A drumbeat began slow, deliberate, like the thud of a fatigued heart. Cadres demanded chants in unison, raising their fists with rigid precision. Villagers repeated the phrases in wavering tones, their voices coated with the dust they inhaled under the sun. A woman's voice cracked mid-sentence, and she lowered her head, immediately terrified the tremor had been noticed. Then came the criticism session. A young man was dragged forward, his shirt sticking to his back where sweat had soaked into the fabric. Dust rose around his feet as he stumbled into the circle, forming a halo that shimmered in the heat. Cadres circled him with stiff, controlled steps, their boots crunching dry leaves in a rhythm that felt rehearsed and merciless. Accusations rained down, each sentence striking with the weight of a blow. Children watched from the edges, their bare toes curling into the warm dirt. A cadre pushed a booklet into their hands, the pages still smelling of factory ink and sweat from the journey south. They were told to recite new slogans, unfamiliar words that scraped awkwardly against their tongues. Even the youngest repeated them, voices trembling, as if the sound itself might invite punishment. The ceremony dragged on, stretching time into something sluggish and unbearable. The heat pressed down like a physical hand, making sweat trace slow paths along temples and down necks. Someone fainted, collapsing with a dull thump that sent dust spiraling upward. No one moved until a cadre gestured sharply for two villagers to drag the limp body aside. By the time the truck finally rolled away, the clearing felt hollowed out. Dust still hung in the air, settling on shoulders' roofs, and the roots of the cashew tree like a thin coating of chalk. Villagers dispersed in small clusters, speaking only in whispers, afraid their voices might still be echoing in the cadre's ears. Evening fires were lit, the comforting smell of smoke drifting upward, but even that familiar scent couldn't erase the taste of humiliation left behind. By the early 1980s, the bush had become a restless, wounded thing. Smoke drifted across the savannah in thin gray veils, carrying the acrid smell of burned classrooms and ambushed convoys. Each morning, villagers woke to the distant thud of explosions vibrating through the soil like a slow, angry heartbeat. Even the birds changed their calls, sounding sharper, more frantic, as if warning anyone who listened. Renamo struck where Mozambique was weakest. They tore up rail lines just as dawn painted the sky in pale orange planting mines that blasted steel into twisted, smoking tendrils. Railway workers arrived moments too late, stepping into air that still smelled of hot metal and scorched ballast. The Beira Corridor began to tremble under the pressure of repeated sabotage, like an artery slowly clogging from within. Schools became battlegrounds. Chalkboards snapped under rifle fire, sending clouds of white dust swirling through empty classrooms like ghostly remnants of abandoned lessons. Desks burned in piles outside their wooden frames, crackling as resin hissed from the heat. Children hid in thickets behind the village, their bare knees pressed into dry earth, while they listened to roofs collapsing with dull, final groans. FRELIMO attempted to answer force with force. Soldiers marched through the bush in long, sweating columns, brushing past grass that whispered against their pant legs. Their boots kicked up the earthy scent of disturbed soil, mixing with the tang of gun oil leaking from overused rifles. Morale flickered like an unstable flame, keeping form, but losing heat with every ambush. The bush itself turned traitor. Footpaths that once led safely to wells became corridors of death, where mines lurked beneath thin layers of red dust. A misstep brought a flash, a roar, and the sickening smell of burned rubber and blood mixing with hot soil. Survivors learned to read the earth's scanning patterns in the dirt, like oracles searching for hidden signs. Renamo raiding parties became brutal, fast-moving storms. They descended on health posts, ripping apart medicine cabinets and smashing glass vials, whose chemical smell lingered long after the rebels vanished. They burned grain stores, turning precious maize into drifting columns of black ash that settled over the fields like mourning cloth. The survivors stumbled through smoke with watering eyes, tasting bitterness in every breath. At night, the sky above the countryside pulsed with fire, distant outposts burning train cars, exploding storage depots collapsing in showers of embers. Villagers huddled inside huts, listening to gunfire echo across valleys and bounce off stone ridges. Every crack of a rifle felt close intimate, as if the bush were wrapping its arms around the violence and carrying it straight to their doors. By mid-decade, Mozambique had fallen into a rhythm of dread. Roads vanished beneath erosion and sabotage. Fields lay half-tended as farmers worked with one eye always fixed on the horizon. And above it all hovered the acrid smell of smoke, constant, familiar, and impossible to escape, signaling that the bush war was no longer spreading. It was consuming. It began before sunrise when Maputo was still wrapped in the gray hush of pre-dawn humidity. Loudspeakers crackled to life atop government trucks, their static-laced commands bouncing off concrete walls like metal scraping metal. Doors opened hesitantly, letting out the smell of boiled cassava and last night's paraffin smoke. Residents stepped outside, clutching documents, breath hanging in faint clouds, as if the city itself were holding its air. Police and party officials moved through the streets, with clipboards hugged tightly to their chests. Pens clicked in sharp mechanical rhythms, each sound slicing through the silence like a blade. People were sorted into lines along the pavement, their slippers brushing dust into thin spirals around their feet. Newspapers lay trampled underfoot the morning's ink, bleeding slightly from the gathering moisture. Those labeled unproductive were pushed toward idling trucks, students without papers, unemployed laborers, widows caught without the right credentials. A boy tried to explain himself, words stuttering from his mouth like broken gears, but an officer pressed a baton to his shoulder with a cold, practiced gentleness. A woman clutched her shawl as she was shoved up the metal ramp, the fabric brushing her cheek with a damp, musty scent. Even the air felt tense, as if the whole street were bracing for something it couldn't stop. Inside the trucks, the metal walls were cold enough to sting fingertips. Bodies swayed as the engine growled to life. Knees knocking against knees, sweat beginning to rise in the cramped heat. The smell of fuel seeped through the wood slats, mixing with the sourness of fear and the faint sweetness of someone's spilled mandazi. The vibration of the engine rattled chests and turned whispers into tremors. The ride stretched endlessly along rutted roads that shook the passengers with every pothole. Grasslands flashed by and streaks of yellow and brown, carrying the dry smell of dust and sun-baked thorns. A child pressed her face against her mother's hip hair, clinging to her forehead in the growing heat. Each jolt made the truck's ribs groan like an animal suffering under unseen weight. At the camp, the air shifted hotter, drier, carrying the smell of eucalyptus, and something metallic drifting from the tools piled nearby. Guards shouted orders as detainees stumbled down the ramp legs, trembling from hours of cramped stillness. Hose with splintered handles were thrust into their hands, the wood rough and thirsty against their palms. The sun rose fully now, its first merciless rays painting the dirt in blinding gold. Rows of makeshift huts sprawled across a dusty plain, their walls breathing out the smell of dried grass and wood smoke. Fires crackled weakly as thin porridge simmered in dented pots, steam rising in pale, exhausted wisps. Cadres delivered speeches about discipline and national rebirth, their voices rising sharply over the coughs and shifting feet of the crowd. Shadows pooled at people's feet, dark stains against the faded red earth. When night finally arrived, it carried no relief. The wind slipped through the cracks in the huts, with a dry, whispering scrape brushing against the cheeks of those lying awake on reed mats that smelled of mold and sweat. Crickets chirped in relentless waves, their rhythm merging with the distant thump of tools left stacked near the fence. And as the camp settled into uneasy silence, one truth pressed down harder than the heat for many brought here: the idea of escape belonged not to reality, but to dreams too fragile to name aloud. The Beira Corridor stretched across Mozambique like a metal artery carrying fuel grain and the last fragile strands of economic life. Freight trains clattered along the rails, their wheels grinding out a rhythmic groan that echoed through the dry savanna. Workers smelled oil and iron every morning as they checked bolts still cool from the night. The corridor felt vulnerable, important, and far too exposed. The first explosion came just as the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in pale gold. A buried mine erupted beneath the front wheels of a locomotive, throwing a geyser of dirt and burning diesel into the air. The blast rattled windows miles away, leaving a bitter chemical smell drifting across the plain. When the smoke thinned, the engine lay on its side, a twisted, steaming carcass on bright orange earth. Repair teams arrived quickly, boots crunching over shattered ballast. They worked in the metallic heat rising off the rails, their hands smelling of rust and grease. Every clang of hammer on steel echoed like a warning. Some men glanced nervously toward the bush, sensing how easily the corridor could be hit again. Renamo struck harder the next time. A fuel convoy was ambushed before noon bullets, punching into tanker cars and releasing shimmering arcs of gasoline into the air. A tracer round ignited the spill, sending a fireball roaring upward with furnace heat. Flames crawled along the tracks, bending metal cracking sleepers and coating everything in black soot that tasted of burned rubber. The corridor turned into a war zone disguised as infrastructure. Charred rail ties snapped underfoot, with brittle pops, their wood still warm long after the flames died. Overturned freight cars leaked grain that mixed with ash, forming a sour, sticky paste along the tracks. Hills of twisted steel rose beside the line, like crude monuments to the chaos consuming the country's backbone. FRELIMO troops patrolled the length of the corridor, moving through waves of shimmering heat. Their uniforms clung to sweat-soaked skin, and the smell of gun oil followed them like a second scent. At night, their flashlights cut thin white beams through drifting smoke, illuminating rails that glowed faintly from daytime sun. Every shadow looked like an ambush waiting to happen. Villagers near the line felt each attack like a tremor beneath their feet. The rumble of explosions traveled through the soil, shaking bowls on shelves and stirring dust from rafters. Children watched distant plumes of smoke rise behind the tree line and mix the scent with fear, hunger, and curiosity. The corridor's suffering became their own. By the late 1980s, the Beira Corridor was scarred and weary, a place where every stretch of straight track hid new dangers. Mozambique's connection to the world narrowed to a fragile thread of rail steel, repeatedly tested by sabotage and fire. And with each attack, the country slipped closer to collapse, as if the corridor's wounds were spreading through the nation itself. In Pretoria's intelligence rooms, Mozambique's agony was nothing more than strategy plotted beneath fluorescent lights. Maps lay pinned to corkboards, their corners curled from heat, marked with neat circles showing supply routes and target zones. The air smelled of stale tobacco and toner from machines that hummed constantly in the corner. Men in pressed uniforms tapped pencils against the maps, studying how best to keep their neighbor weak. Night after night, unmarked trucks rolled out from hidden depots in northern South Africa. Canvas flaps fluttered in the wind, releasing faint whiffs of gun oil, and rough wooden crates stacked tight together. Drivers chewed stale biscuits as they navigated dirt tracks under star-choked skies. Engines kept at a low purr to avoid attention. Each delivery fed Renamo's growing appetite for sabotage rifles, radios, explosives, all hidden beneath layers of tarpaulin dust. The Soviets played their own part across the battle lines. Massive Antonov cargo planes descended onto Maputo's runway with a roar that shook the windows of nearby homes. When their doors opened, the cool smell of Siberian-built steel and treated wood spilled out, along with crates of weapons stamped in Cyrillic. Advisors descended the ramps with stern faces, their boots thudding on the tarmac like measured drums of certainty. East German instructors followed, moving into barracks that still reeked of lime wash and damp fabric. They drilled security forces with strict discipline, boots-aligned rifles cleaned until the oil residue smelled sharp and precise. Their voices barked commands with clipped harshness, leaving new recruits sweating under the weight of expectations they barely understood. Lessons written in German ink soaked into Mozambique's soil. Zimbabwe, caught between solidarity and survival, patrolled its border with a wary intensity. Soldiers moved through thorny bush, the scent of crushed acacia lingering on their uniforms, ears trained for whispers of Renamo infiltration. Helicopters chopped through the air above them, kicking dust into spirals that stung their eyes. Each patrol felt like walking a tightrope stretched across two unstable nations. Meanwhile, ordinary Mozambicans stumbled through consequences shaped far beyond their understanding. A South African supply drop meant a Renamo raid that left huts burned and fields swallowed in smoke. A Soviet shipment meant more FRELIMO patrols trudging through villages, boots smearing mud into floors swept clean only minutes before. Foreign motives drifted invisibly above them like storm clouds too distant to see, but close enough to drown the land. Diplomats in distant capitals debated regional stability over polished tables that smelled faintly of coffee and furniture wax. They spoke of leverage containment and ideological balance, clean, tidy words that ignored the blood drying on Mozambique's dirt roads. Each handshake and signature in those rooms formed ripples that reached villages where no electricity hummed and no newspapers arrived. By the mid-1980s, Mozambique's war was no longer simply Mozambique's. It had become a proxy conflict shaped by superpowers and regional rivals, a battlefield chosen not by the people who lived there, but by the men who armed both sides. And with every crate unloaded in Maputo or smuggled across the frontier, the country sank deeper into a conflict fueled by hands it would never see. Stories drifted out of the bush long before investigators reached the scenes themselves. Traders arrived in markets with dust caked into the folds of their clothes, whispering about villages turned to charcoal skeletons. Their voices shook as they described the sweet, nauseating smell of burned maize lingering over empty courtyards. Fear traveled faster than refugees carried in fragments from one district to the next. In many raids, Renamo moved with a violence that felt rehearsed. Fighters kicked down doors with boots stained in red soil, splintering wood that snapped like brittle bones. Families were dragged from their huts into the harsh moonlight, their shadows trembling across the ground. Women felt cold hands close around their wrists, fingers digging deep enough to leave pale imprints that lasted for days. Captives were often marched through the night, forced along narrow paths where dew chilled their ankles. The rebels kept them moving with the flat sides of machetes, the metal cold and unforgiving against their backs. When someone stumbled, the sound of branches snapping under their weight mingled with choked sobs. The bush echoed with footfalls, whispered commands, and the rustling of fear itself. The camps they reached smelled of sweat baked into the ground and smoke trapped beneath low tree canopies. Children learned to load magazines by touch their small fingers trembling as they slid cold metal into place. Thin porridge simmered in dented pots, giving off a sour, burnt smell that clung to lips long after eating. Nights were filled with the quiet, stifled cries of new abductees trying not to be heard. Renamo commanders used terror as strategy, not accident. They executed village leaders in front of their communities, leaving bodies on footpaths to rot under the sun. The sickly scent of decay spread on the afternoon wind, warning nearby villages before any messenger arrived. Even trees bore scars where ropes had bitten into bark during public punishments. Humanitarian investigators later walked through the remains of these attacks, stepping over charred beams and broken pots. The ground gave off the faint smell of wet ash, refusing to release its memories, even after the rains. Personal belongings, a sandal, a cracked bowl, a child's wooden toy lay half buried in dirt, as if waiting for hands that would never return. Their reports filled page after page, ink-marking horrors that could not be softened by distance. Survivors' testimonies added details so raw they felt carved into the air. Men spoke of being forced to loot their neighbors' homes, the sound of tearing sacks and smashing pots echoing in their ears long afterward. Women remembered hiding in dry riverbeds, the cold mud pressing into their skin as they listened for approaching footsteps. Children described the sting of thorns tearing their feet during endless marches under moonlit skies. By the late 1980s, Renamo's brutality was no longer rumor or propaganda, it was documented reality. Aid workers arrived shaking their clothes, carrying the earthy scent of burned villages and long journeys through dangerous bush. And though both sides committed atrocities, the scale and ritualized nature of Renamo's terror left scars deeper than the war itself, scars still visible even after the guns began to fall silent. The corridor stretched ahead like an open wound carved across the land, its soil faded into a sickly orange where nothing living dared to grow. Heat shimmered above the ground in wavering curtains, twisting the horizon into a trembling mirage. Alima stepped forward with her child tied to her back, the cloth damp with his shallow, uneven breaths. The air tasted of dust so fine it felt like powdered bone settling on her tongue. Every few steps a gust of hot wind pushed against her face, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and the faint, bitter smoke of villages long burned. Her sandals scraped against cracked earth, each fissure rising like jagged scars beneath her feet. The child whimpered a thin sound that quivered into the stillness before dissolving entirely. Alima tightened her grip on the straps, feeling the bones of his shoulders pressing lightly against her palms. The ruins of a settlement appeared ahead, nothing more than blackened huts standing crooked like broken ribs jutting from the ground. Charcoal beams crumbled when she brushed them with her fingers, leaving streaks of soot on her skin. A cooking pot lay overturned nearby, its inside coated with a brittle layer of something burned long ago. Even the silence seemed to remember what had happened here, heavy and unmoving. As she continued deeper into the corridor, flies gathered around her child's exposed neck, buzzing with a relentless electric hum. She brushed them away, but they returned immediately, drawn by the scent of sweat and hunger. The air grew thicker, warmer, carrying the metallic odor of old blood from riverbeds where bodies had once been left unburied. Each inhale felt like swallowing heat. Her legs trembled as she walked, blisters forming beneath the leather straps of her sandals. When she stumbled, her hands hit the ground, sending a puff of dust upward that coated her lips with a bitter metallic film. She pushed herself up slowly, joints stiff and aching, the skin on her knees stinging where gravel had scraped it raw. The sun bore down with a weight that felt almost personal. A stand of mopane trees shimmered in the distance, their leaves clapping softly in the dry wind like faint applause. Alima reached them just as her vision began to blur at the edges. She touched the rough bark of the nearest trunk, its coolness startling after hours of blistering heat. Her child's breath fluttered weakly against her back, barely shifting the cloth that held him. A dried-up waterhole sat beyond the trees, a shallow bowl of earth cracked into irregular patterns. She knelt and dragged her fingers through the dirt, lifting small clumps to her lips. The moisture tasted warm, gritty, and filled with the earthy tang of desperation. Her child released a faint broken cry, the sound thin as paper tearing in her ear. Evening crept across the corridor, stretching shadows long and thin over the wounded land. Alima rose again, her silhouette wavering in the sinking light, as if the heat were trying to erase her from sight. The wind brushed past her with a whispering scrape, carrying away the dust rising from her steps, and she walked on a single figure moving through a vast, empty landscape shaped by war hunger and the quiet determination to survive one more mile. The news spread long before anyone knew the details, a strange, uneasy murmur rolling through Maputo like a cold draft slipping under locked doors. Samora Machel's Tupolev had vanished from the sky somewhere over the Lobombo Mountains, swallowed by the darkness beyond the southern border. People stepped out of their homes, the humid night air carrying the faint smell of sea salt and diesel from the port. Radios hissed static, then fell silent again, amplifying the creeping dread. On the mountain ridge, the wreckage burned in a slow, exhausted glow. Twisted metal frames hissed as rain from the low clouds met the scorching debris, sending up wisps of steam that clung to the air with a bitter chemical smell. The shattered fuselage lay scattered across the rocks like a broken carcass, pieces still warm beneath the hands of rescuers. Uniformed South African personnel moved through the smoke in tight controlled lines, the beam of their flashlights cutting through the wet haze. For hours, nothing reached Mozambique except rumors each heavier than the last. Elders gathered outside corner shops, the night wind tugging at their capulanas, as they whispered about sabotage betrayals and secret beacons planted in the hills. The scent of diesel lamps mixed with the uneasy sweat of a crowd that knew something irreversible had just happened. Even children sensed the shift, clinging close to their mothers without knowing why. When confirmation finally came at dawn, the announcement crackled through radios in a flat, stunned monotone. President Samora Machel is dead. The words hung in the air like smoke from a doused fire, leaving a bitter taste in the mouths of those who heard them. Women pressed cloths to their faces as if trying to catch their breath. Men stood frozen, their hands drifting instinctively to their chests, as if steadying their hearts. The capital moved in slow motion. Posters of Machel fluttered on walls, their edges trembling in the morning breeze as if the paper itself were grieving. People filled the streets with soft footsteps, the smell of incense rising from small improvised altars along the sidewalks. A heaviness clung to the city, not loud or chaotic, but numb, the quiet ache of a nation realizing its guiding voice had been cut mid-sentence. Inside government buildings, fear settled deeper than mourning. Ministers paced hallways that smelled faintly of old coffee and disinfectant, their shoes clicking sharply on the tile. Some whispered that South Africa had engineered the crash. Others suspected internal betrayal. No one dared say it aloud, but the sense of stability, already thin from war, was now cracking like old plaster along the walls. The countryside received the news differently. In villages lit by morning cooking fires, women paused with wooden spoons suspended above simmering pots. Smoke curled into the air, carrying the soft scent of maize porridge, as neighbors exchanged wide-eyed glances. For many, Machel had been the symbolic father whose portrait hung between family photographs. His death felt like the roof of their home had suddenly vanished, and as Mozambique buried its president, the country shifted on its axis. Confidence wavered. FRELIMO's unity thinned. A war they believed they could still win now pressed down like a closing fist. In the vacuum left by the crash on that dark mountain slope, a new and unsettling question took shape, not spoken aloud, but felt everywhere whether Mozambique could survive without the man who had once held the nation together by sheer force of will. By the late 1980s, Maputo felt like a city slowly collapsing inward. Power cuts stretched for hours, leaving entire neighborhoods bathed in the blue-gray glow of dusk, even at midday. People queued outside state warehouses before dawn, their breath carrying the sour scent of spoiled grain as they waited for rations that often never arrived. The air tasted of salt blown in from the sea, mixed with the dusty bitterness of exhaustion. Currency lost value faster than shopkeepers could change their handwritten signs. Prices smudged under sweaty fingertips as workers crossed them out and replaced them with higher numbers. Families stood before empty shelves, touching the bare metal, as if hoping the cool surface might hide food somewhere inside. Thin porridge simmered in pots across the city, its watery smell drifting through narrow alleys like a reminder of how little remained. Inside government ministries, despair clung to walls like mildew. Files stacked in leaning towers gave off the musty scent of paper left too long in humidity. Meetings stretched into the night with ministers arguing over maps stained by spilled tea and worn from too many frantic fingers. Cigarette smoke curled above their heads as they whispered fears no one dared voice publicly that the revolution was bleeding out. Soldiers returned from the bush, gaunt in hollow-eyed uniforms, stiff with sweat and dust. Their boots left dry red footprints on the ministry floor, traces of the war following them into the heart of the capital. Many had not been paid in months. Some hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Their rifles smelled of old oil rust and the faint metallic tang of regret. On the outskirts, entire barracks fell into disrepair. Roof sheets rattled in the night wind, banging against warped beams with dull metallic groans. Fires burned low in iron drums, releasing the acrid scent of damp wood and scavenged trash. Sitting around them, soldiers murmured about desertion, not loudly, but openly enough that the idea stretched like a shadow across every conversation. Villages sensed the government's weakness more acutely than the capital. Once regular patrols grew rare, replaced by distant echoes of gunfire that bounced between trees. Farmers walked through their fields with machetes tucked into belts, eyes scanning tree lines where Renamo scouts lurked. The smell of recently extinguished cooking fires drifted above homesteads' families ready to flee at a moment's notice. In Maputo, humanitarian workers filled the void. Their canvas tents snapped in the coastal wind, carrying the scent of disinfectant and sun-baked plastic. Clinics overflowed with malnourished children whose breath smelled faintly sweet, a quiet sign of starvation. Aid trucks rumbled down cracked roads, their engines wheezing, as if mimicking the country's own labored heartbeat. Within FRELIMO's leadership, fractures deepened. Some urged total war-pounding fists on tables that vibrated with their frustration. Others insisted negotiations were the only path forward, their voices thick with the fatigue of years spent defending a dream that no longer matched reality. The tension charged the air heavy like the ozone smell before a storm. Mozambique stood teetering on the edge, its economy collapsing, its soldiers starving, its leadership shaken by the loss of its founding president. The war no longer felt ideological or revolutionary. It felt like a drowning, slow and suffocating. And in that suffocation, even the most loyal began to consider what had once been unthinkable, talking to the enemy. The first murmurs of negotiations drifted into Maputo like a rumor carried on a weak, uncertain breeze. People heard them in ration lines, their hands wrapped around dented tins, while the smell of stale flour clung to the air. Some scoffed. Others stared ahead in numb silence, as if afraid that hope itself might break them. The city felt suspended, hungry, exhausted, skeptical. Diplomats began arriving discreetly, stepping off planes with briefcases that still smelled of airport coffee and recycled cabin air. They gathered in conference rooms lit by flickering fluorescent tubes, the hum of the lights mixing with the rustle of papers slid across polished tables. Maps were unfolded, pens clicked, and voices fell into careful, precise tones. The sweet scent of overbrewed tea drifted from the corners of the room, as if trying to soften conversations that refused to soften. FRELIMO officials entered these meetings with hollow eyes and stiff shoulders. Many still carried the bush on their uniforms, faint traces of smoke embedded in the fabric patches, stiff with dried sweat. Their footsteps echoed through the marble corridors as they hesitated in front of doors where their authority felt threadbare. Behind closed panels, they argued in low, tense murmurs that carried the sharp smell of cigarette ash and fear. Far away from the capital, Renamo leaders received the idea with resentful suspicion. They huddled around wood fires that crackled under thick branches, flames releasing the resinous smell of burning mopane. Couriers arrived with messages folded into sweat-stained envelopes carrying updates written in shaky ink. The commanders squinted through smoke as they debated, some snarling at the idea of peace, others whispering that fatigue was winning the war faster than bullets. Regional powers added their own invisible pressure. South African envoys traveled quietly between capitals, their colognes unable to mask the scent of bureaucracy and ambition that trailed them. Zimbabwean officers sent cautious signals, aware that another year of chaos would spill instability across their borders like an overflowing river. Each meeting, formal or informal, pushed Mozambique a step closer toward a path no one fully trusted. Meanwhile, ordinary Mozambicans tried to interpret the sudden shift in mood. In rural districts, families listened to distant radio broadcasts through static-filled speakers that smelled faintly of warmed plastic. Farmers paused mid-hoe as voices mentioned dialogue and process words that felt foreign in fields still scarred by shell craters. Mothers stirred pots of thin porridge, their wooden spoons tracing slow circles, as if measuring out this strange, cautious possibility. Aid workers, exhausted from years of documenting despair, clung to the negotiations more tightly than anyone else. Their boots carried the dust of burned villages, and their notebooks were filled with names of survivors written in smudged pencil. They moved between camps with renewed urgency, the scent of chlorine and antiseptic trailing behind them. For them, peace was not an idea, it was the only remaining escape from a humanitarian abyss. Yet every step toward negotiation felt fragile, like walking across cracked glass. Too many massacres had burned themselves into the collective memory, leaving a bitterness that clung to conversations even in Rome's echoing halls. Both sides arrived at the early sessions, stiff and silent hands trembling slightly as they reached for pens that smelled faintly of fresh ink. No one admitted it out loud, but each knew the truth. Mozambique was too broken to keep fighting and too wounded to trust the hand reaching across the table. The basilica's vaulted ceilings swallowed every sound, turning footsteps into soft echoes that drifted among columns older than Mozambique itself. Delegates entered in slow, deliberate movements, their suits hanging loosely on frames thinned by years of war. The air carried the faint scent of incense, soaked deep into stone walls, mixing with the sharper tang of polished wood and fresh parchment. This holy place felt strangely at odds with the violence they had brought in their memories. Renamo's representatives arrived first, stiff-backed and wary, their eyes scanning every corner as if expecting an ambush even here. Their jackets smelled of long flights and pressed fabric, but beneath that lingered something earthier, the dust of the bush they had lived in for so long. When they set their folders on the table, the papers inside rustled with a brittle, tentative sound. Their hands hovered slightly above the pens, hesitating as if peace might be another trap. Frelimo's delegation entered moments later, accompanied by aides whose shoes clicked softly on the marble floor. Some carried the scent of old cigarette smoke embedded in their coats, reminders of endless nights spent arguing over whether negotiation meant surrender. Their faces showed the exhaustion of a government strained to breaking eyes, ringed in shades of gray and red. When they saw their former enemies seated across from them, a brief, heavy silence settled. The mediators spoke first, their voices low but steady, rising toward the high dome where dust motes drifted like tiny floating lanterns. Documents were slid across the table, the parchment cool to the touch edges, sharp beneath trembling fingers. Around the room, the muted scratch of pens and the shuffle of robes created a fragile rhythm, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Each clause discussed felt like peeling back scar tissue, painful but necessary. Outside rain tapped gently against the stained glass windows, leaving faint trails that glimmered in the morning light. The scent of wet stone seeped in through the old wooden doors, grounding the moment in something real and alive. For a brief time, the sound of distant Roman traffic mingled with the murmured negotiations, two worlds brushing against each other. In that strange union, the war felt far away yet unbearably close. When the time finally came to sign, the air tightened. Chairs scraped softly against the marble as both delegations leaned forward, the weight of the pens feeling heavier than rifles. The first signature left a dark, glistening trail of ink that reflected the stained glass colors above. A few diplomats exhaled shakily, the warm smell of nervous sweat rising in the still air. Applause followed, restrained, cautious, almost reluctant at first. Then it grew echoing through the basilica in deeper and deeper waves. Some delegates wiped tears with the backs of their hands, the salt leaving faint streaks on their skin. Others simply stared at the papers, dazed, as if waiting for someone to shout that it wasn't real. Outside, Rome's bells rang out their reverberations, cascading over rooftops slick with rain. To the Mozambican negotiators, the sound felt foreign and impossible, hopeful in a way they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in years. As they stepped into the open air, the damp breeze brushed against their faces, carrying the scent of wet cobblestones and old city life. And in that moment, standing beneath a gray Roman sky, both sides realized that the war had truly begun to loosen its grip. Peace arrived not with celebration, but with a long, trembling exhale that moved unevenly across Mozambique. Villages emerged from hiding places in the bush, their residents blinking into the sunlight as if the world had changed its shape while they were gone. Smoke from morning cook fires drifted into the air, carrying the familiar scent of burning acacia and wet earth. For the first time in years, the crackle of flames wasn't followed by the distant echo of gunfire. Roads once feared became tentative lifelines again. Sappers marked danger zones with thin red flags, their boots sinking into soil, still warm from the sun. Each time their probes struck metal, they froze the air, thickening breaths held before a detonation thudded through the plains, shaking dust from the leaves. The sharp smell of explosives hung briefly in the air before dissolving into the wind, leaving cleared paths behind. Ex-fighters returned to their homes in slow, uncertain steps. Their uniforms hung loose on bodies thinned by rationed meals and sleepless nights. The metallic scent of gun oil clung to their hands, stubborn, even after repeated washing at village pumps. Families greeted them with trembling embraces, mixing relief with the painful awareness that the men and boys who left were not the same ones who returned. In town's markets, unfurled like flowers after a long drought, vendors dusted off tables scarred by years of neglect, arranging tomatoes that glowed red under the sun and cassava roots still smelling of fresh soil. Children darted between stalls with bare feet slapping against warm pavement. Their laughter rose into the air with a brightness the war had smothered for more than a decade. Reconstruction crept forward brick by brick. School walls were replastered, the scent of wet cement hanging sharp and promising in the air. Nurses reopened clinics with windows that rattled in the coastal breeze, unpacking gauze and medicine bottles that smelled faintly of antiseptic and new beginnings. Even government offices regained a pulse, typewriters clacking again, papers shuffled, conversations spoken at full volume instead of cautious whispers. But the shadows remained. Old prison blocks still held the mildew scent of sweat and fear baked into their walls. Families walked past minefield markers that fluttered in the wind like thin red warnings from the past. At night, men woke from dreams of ambushes, the phantom crack of gunfire ringing in their ears. Women paused when unfamiliar engines growled in the distance, memories tightening their breath before reason eased it again. Still life pushed forward even through those lingering ghosts. Churches filled with hymns that floated into the morning light like strands of smoke. Fishermen returned to rivers once lined with bodies, their nets dripping with the clean smell of algae and fresh water. Children kicked ragged footballs on fields reclaimed from danger dust, rising beneath their heels in warm, sunlit clouds. Every evening, as the sky shifted into deep orange lanterns, flickered to life across villages and towns. Soft yellow light spilled through doorways, illuminating repaired walls and newly swept floors. Somewhere in the darkness, a mother hummed to her child, her voice blending with the whisper of the night wind. Mozambique was learning to breathe again, unevenly, imperfectly, but unmistakably alive, carrying its scars into a future finally free to unfold.